Hi everyone, welcome to World Affairs in Context. Before we begin, please take a second to follow the podcast on alternative media channels. You will find them linked in the description below, as always. Nobody wants to talk about this particular subject, so I decided to go ahead and dedicate an entire video to this unpopular topic. Did you know that the interest burden of the United States just hit a 28-year high? A 28-year high. This is a really big issue. They're downplaying it, they're ignoring it, and we haven't really heard either candidate address it. Still, we're less than 2 weeks away from the elections, and both candidates are doing really well ignoring the issue. But the fact that the US Treasury now pays more to cover interest on its surging national debt than it does on defense, for example, and I will go into details in just a second, that is a red flag of a growing fiscal gap. Interest expense on national debt now amounts to just above 3% of GDP, the highest reading since the mid-1990s. National debt is fueled by budget deficits, which is something that both parties are very much willing to ignore. The problem will persist as long as the politicians in charge continue to borrow more and more to spend on things that benefit a small group of people, not the US population. At this time, national debt balance is approaching $35.8 trillion with a T, trillion dollars, with the US debt to GDP ratio exceeding 122%. Very often you ask me in the comments about who owns US national debt. So very briefly, we're not going to dedicate a lot of time to this, but very briefly, the biggest portion, about $9.2 trillion, is owned by foreign governments, with China and Japan being the top holders. Then the second biggest portion, nearly $5 trillion, is owned by mutual funds, and the third place, $3.1 trillion, is owned by individuals. According to the latest report, as of the September 30th, 2024, published by the United States Treasury, the US government spent a total of $882 billion on net interest payments alone in the fiscal year through the end of September. I will remind you that its fiscal year goes through October, unlike our normal calendar year. So it spent $882 billion on interest expense alone. For the months of September, if you just want to look at this on a monthly basis, the interest cost on national debt was $38 billion. During the entire 2024, the United States government spent an average of roughly $2.5 billion. That's right, $2.5 billion per day to cover interest expense. Debt servicing was among the fastest growing parts of the US budget. Why does it matter, you may ask? Well, it matters because every dollar that goes towards interest payments means less resources that are available for the population. What's very suspicious is that the debt ceiling debate is frozen until 2025. We're not even hearing about this right now. The debt ceiling was suspended purposefully until after the election because this is a big issue. Well, this is something that directly impacts the quality of life of the United States population and future generations, because this is the burden for the future generations. You have to question why this is happening. Why? We're being distracted by a variety of other issues, but the most important ones are brushed aside. Because if you were to question growing deficits, and if you were to question surging national debt, then you would have to address how funding wars overseas year after year directly contributes to your economic decline, both domestically and internationally. So it is easy to ignore this altogether. The increase in spending on interest costs means that other government-funded programs, such as Social Security, for example, will have to take a cut. It will have to take a hit eventually. If we return back to the September Treasury report that I just showed you a couple of minutes ago, we can notice here that the total deficit now stands at $1.8 billion. On the left-hand side are your total receipts, or US government income in other words, and on the right-hand side of this illustration, you've got your outlays, or your expenses. Net interest cost is now number 3 on that list on your right-hand side. The government spends the most on Social Security, health, and then net interest. Net interest has already exceeded what the United States government spends on such programs as Medicare, national defense, veterans benefits. Those are way down the list, as well as education and transportation. I would even argue that if you look at this list of expenses that I just showed you, you can clearly trace priorities. If you don't care for your veterans, but you love funding wars, and if you don't care to improve your education system, but you send billions overseas and you rack up billions in deficits year after year, what does that really tell us about whose interests are being served? Comment below and let me know what you think about this. I would love to hear from you as always. In just 10 years, government spending on interest expense, and I do believe that this is the best case scenario, this is by no means a conservative estimate, it will exceed Medicare spending. Then Social Security may be next on that chopping block if this trend continues. Here's an excellent illustration of interest expense versus defense spending. You can clearly track the increase, and in 2021, there's a steep jump. If you look at that bright blue line, there's a steep jump in net interest cost. That was due to an increase not only in interest rates at that time, but also in borrowing as well. Speaking about interest expense, we need to quickly mention the national debt to GDP ratio. Debt held by the public portion of national debt is quickly approaching 100% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office projects that if current laws governing revenues and spending generally remained unchanged, the federal budget deficit would increase significantly in relation to gross domestic product GDP over the next 30 years, driving up federal debt. Debt held by the public would soar from 90% of GDP in 2024 to 166%. It will nearly double by 2054, exceeding any previously recorded levels and on track to increase even further. So hitting a 28-year high in interest expense alone is just the beginning. If those on the Capitol Hill do not start prioritizing the interests of the population above their own political agenda and the agenda of those who directly benefit from current policies, this is just the beginning. This is unfortunately just the beginning. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. What do you think about the growing national debt and hitting a new record high in interest expense? I would love to hear from you. As always, thank you for watching. I appreciate you joining me for yet another video. Please remember to show your support, like, subscribe, and share. For exclusive content, make sure that you check out my alternative social media channels. I'm currently working on new projects that I will reveal to you soon. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.